Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the Web Platform Podcast, episode number 182. Today we're talking about Calibre and web performance. I am your host this week, Justin Barrow. Everyone else is either snowed in the polar vortex of the United States or on vacation. So it's just going to be me, though I will cut away to Danny, who is going to do this probably in his car for This Week in Web. We're going to talk about web performance today. Before we introduce our guest, we are going to go over the latest in news. So I'm going to throw it over to Danny in his car for This Week in Web in 2 minutes or less. Danny?
Thank you, Justin. Firefox 65 has landed this week with a host of new features, including WebP and AV1 support, Flexbox Inspector, Accessibility Inspector updates, readable streams, and international relative time format, among so much more. Check out the blog post in the show notes to find out more. Doug Seiler's December post on Base64 encoding and its performance anti-pattern is making the rounds this morning. Still using it? Find out why you shouldn't. iOS 12.2 beta has some extremely solid PWA updates, including auth flows and the Web Share API, so that's good news for everybody that uses the web platform. Paul Lewis sat down with Paul Irish in a meeting of the Pauls to discuss the transition from super varied projects to working on Lighthouse. And that's all for This Week in Web. Back to you, Justin.
Thank you, Danny. Very interesting things happening this week on the web. I'm really interested to see just some of the stuff in Firefox 65, which looks really, really nifty. Hey, WebP finally. But we're not talking about that kind of a thing, though WebP is somewhat on the performance spectrum for things. Today, we're talking about Calibre and web performance monitoring. So I want to introduce our guest, Ben. Ben, welcome to the show.
Hey, how are you?
I am doing well. And how about yourself, sir?
Oh, so fine this morning. It's summer in Australia. It's fantastic.
Yeah, I figure we have gotten the good weather out of this. I'm in California. You're in Australia. A little warmer where you're at this point.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well. You know, I'm really looking forward to this episode. I'm a big fan of web performance. I know that you and I ran into each other at Chrome Dev Summit and chit-chatted about web performance with colleagues and whatnot. But for those of you out there who don't know you, how about you introduce yourself and tell everyone a little bit about kind of what you do?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Ben Schwarz. I'm the founder of Calibre, which is a tool that's focused around the idea of somehow trying to make the web faster by helping people have tools to be able to do that and to be able to stuff. But also we hope that a lot of the research that we're doing sort of enters your consciousness of while you're trying to build a website and while you're trying to make something faster. So that's my core focus these days. But back in the past, I've worked with the WhatWG and W3C like way back in the day. I ran JSConf here in Australia and CSSConf and a couple of other events in the Ruby community. I've done a lot of community work, but at the moment I'm really focused on my own business in Calibre and just trying to make a bit of an impact there.
Yeah, you've been around the web for a long time. You've sort of seen the progression of the web happen over time. I know that I get made fun of a lot on the show. I've been around on the web a long time myself. Do you enjoy the web that is today? Like, do you think the web has overall sort of advanced to this state where we are now really happy about monitoring things like web performance?
Yeah, I didn't use the internet. I'm almost 35. I didn't use the internet until I was 17. And within a week, I had built a website, right? And I was completely enamored with the web, and I still am today. And I think where the web is heading is hugely exciting. And now there's so much that I don't understand, like WebAssembly or 3D graphics in the browser with WebGL, or some of those things that are actually introducing other kinds of people and other kinds of creators to the web. I think that is like super exciting. So yeah, I don't know. I'm a part of it, I guess, in some kind of way, and I'm thrilled about that.
It is an interesting time to be a developer. I mean, beforehand we had such limited tooling, on the web to do some of the things that to some extent we take for granted today. We can do sort of those interactive sites that in the past were just really outside of our reach. Do you find that you've built Calibre, which is this great web performance monitoring tool? Do you find that now, as people have started to turn inward towards those sorts of technologies where the web has gotten a little heavier, that people are starting to say, hey, I do need to monitor this performance. I do need to make sure that, hey, all these fancy tools allow me to still be productive against there?
Yeah, I really, when I started Calibre, and I guess I could talk about it as well, but when I started Calibre, it was an interest of mine to track performance and to see what it meant if we started, tracking these things that users were experiencing from the browser in a repeatable manner, right? When I started that, people weren't. I mean, people are interested in performance because they're developers, right? But beyond that, people weren't that interested. Whereas now, with tools like Lighthouse being out, and other tooling being available as well, and open source, and in paid products, everyone is into performance. Write an article about React performance there, and people are jumping all over it, and they're so excited by it. And all these frameworks, every new framework that comes out has these performance claims. Whether or not they have benchmarks is another matter. But people want to be fast. It's the cool thing to do. But I mean, beyond that, I think it's insanely important to be there, and to be to have a great experience for your customers and folks.
Do you find that, a lot of times we talk about end users and we talk about developers, and sometimes they don't necessarily go hand in hand. We have this notion that, there are some things that are convenient for developers. Hey, I can use X framework or library that has some performance overhead against it. And then users are going on the other side going, well, I don't care what framework you use. It'll help me just render this thing in 5 seconds. Do you find that measure of success, do you find that gap is still quite wide, or have we started to narrow that gap where developers are now much more cognizant of sort of the empathy for end users?
I was just thinking about, I don't know if I can even describe it, but that meme that's going around where it's got like the picture of the head and like the brain activity when they're learning the level of thing. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about.
Oh yeah.
I don't even know what you call that thing, but where I think at the moment we're somewhere in the middle. We're aware that it's important. We're excited about tools. All of that is true, right? But we don't, as builders of the web, I don't honestly believe that we have enough focus on the people that we say that we're building for. We're not, predominantly, we're not testing on, actual real devices that people use. We're not testing on real connectivity that people have, or with spotty connectivity, or any of those things. And sure, tooling will help there. But I do feel like that there's a bit of a gap there. And it's really about educating each other and sharing our results, and, maybe not getting so caught up on tools, but if you use a tool and you have some success there, then that's awesome, and you should tell people about it. But I mean, people just love their JavaScript, right? So, yeah, it's a tough issue to ride there, I think.
Yeah, we definitely sort of moved into that land where a lot of people think that only JavaScript is the web, which I think is somewhat unfortunate, given that the sort of the strides we've made on the DOM, especially on the CSS side these days. But developers, I mean, it's tough, right? You've got stakeholders, you've got all these things, and hey, I need this, I need feature X, and then you end up with this terrible amount of feature creep and stacks of things, and you end up with these layers that quite literally no one really quite understands, I think, performance wise, because I think, again, like you said, right, you could, we have the technologies there, but is performance still going to be that baseline? And the tool, we've definitely seen an increase in the amount of tooling that tries to help developers there, wouldn't you say?
I think it has, but I think if you come back to the tooling and people who love their tools and build everything in JavaScript or not, whatever your choice is there, uh, it doesn't matter as long as you're productive and you're building something that was better than that was there before, right? Like if we get to the point where we're hyper focused on user experience in every meaning of the word, then great. And I don't think we're there, but we're not there for a bunch of other reasons, right? Like we're not there because our PM just wants us to ship it, or there's a deadline, or there's ad technology that we can't do anything with, or whatever those constraints are. So it can be difficult to make that kind of impact where we have that focus on like, okay, performance is the most important thing. It's not. I mean, accessibility is really important too, but people don't get to work on accessibility because people don't perceive it as important. And 1 in 5 people have some kind of vision impairment, right? So it's like, okay, well, 20% of people using the web, well, 20% in Australia anyway. I don't know about the rest of the world, but if they can't see the content, it doesn't matter in the first place.
I think that's a fair point. I think we have a tendency to prioritize things that are perceived as sort of important, as opposed to things that we have some metric against, right? Like the notion of accessibility. Calibre helps with some of these things, as a matter of fact, because at the end of the day, you're actually tracking performance, which I find that a lot of organizations simply don't quite have a grasp on.
Yeah, for sure. So I'll just explain Calibre a little bit. I guess that would be useful.
Yeah.
Calibre, you what sites and pages you want to run, and it will, on a scheduler, go and test those pages. You can test up to every hour if you want to. There's also an API where if you wanted to, where it keeps just hammering the site and testing. But every time it does that, it running Lighthouse internally, and a bunch of other Calibre magic in there, and it's trying to give you metrics that describe a user's experience, and then it's trying to give you the tooling to actually do something with. So maybe we're going to post it out to your Slack channel or email your team when something goes over a certain threshold, or have a dashboard for people to compare their competitors, or those kinds of things. So with Calibre, where we really want people to automate this whole process, because you can't. You honestly cannot be in DevTools in every browser situation, in every connectivity situation either, and you also can't beam yourself to the other side of the world. So one thing that Calibre does is it can test from 4 locations around the world. So that's like South America or Singapore or Tokyo, or a few locations in the US as well. So if you have all your customers are in Central Europe, well, you can get a bunch of testing from there on a 3G device, and you can get an idea of what they're actually experiencing as a baseline performance, sort of metric, and then you can work on that, right? You try and improve it, or you can see when you falter a little bit.
And I think that's important. I work with a lot of orgs who they've definitely started to see that the baseline sort of performance system they do is okay, but like you said, they don't live in DevTools. So if you don't live in DevTools, DevTools has gotten easier to use, but at the same time, the performance sort of characteristics of particular sites are actually relatively hard to sort of assess, depending on which portion of that site you may be working on. Um, measuring things in the actual environment where users are using are actually very different than sort of the bubble that we as developers live in. Do you think that developers are starting to notice this fact and go, oh, maybe I should not test this on my locally really super fast thing that I don't have to deal with any network performance issues across the board? Are people starting to understand that, you think?
I think they are. Also, I think we're all learning the hard way, right? So people are, people are doing a test, and particularly, I work closely with the Lighthouse team, And I'm always in the issue tracker, and I'm always reading everything that's coming through, and wondering if I can help people. But I see a lot of people who say, "Oh, my Lighthouse score went to, and our website is better than that. I know it is." And it's like, well, so you're on a connection that's not that fast, maybe, and you've also throttled the network to be 3G. So um, you've got a spotty connection coming in, and it's slow, right? Like, it's slower than expecting. Because when you hit refresh in your browser, you're seeing that it renders everything in under 5 seconds, but in Lighthouse maybe it's a bunch slower. So people are having to go, "Why is this wrong?" Until they go, "Oh, I see." The other thing about performance or monitoring or metrics in the first place is people are very reactive. They'll see a bump in a line where they, maybe something went from 2 seconds to 3 seconds between two different tests, and they think, "Oh, well, I didn't do anything, so obviously the tool is wrong." And what with internet being involved, there's so much stuff that can happen there. It can be delayed third party delivering some JavaScript, or it can be a slow DNS request coming through, or it could be that your machine, when you were running Lighthouse, was doing a whole bunch of other high activity, right? So getting that consistent environment is really actually pretty difficult, and that's why I kind of built Calibre, because it gives you that dedicated environment where all of that stuff is just being taken care of. We don't we run this service for that purpose, and so you get really good quality metrics because of that. And I think that helps, and definitely, as the tool has been built out, there's definitely been times where we've had to work to make it more consistent by doing things like detecting anomalies. So if your site suddenly tests far slower in one of 2 or 3 different metrics that we keep in, we'll just retest it again up to 3 times. And so we get a really good basis of your performance, and it smooths out those graphs. And so people don't have to be so reactionary to them, which helps too. So it's a little bit on the tooling side, and it's a little bit on the understanding of metrics and statistics and what's relevant and what's not, right? Sometimes a 1 second bump isn't statistically useful. So it's important to keep in mind that we're overall what we want to do is lower the average, or even the P95 of the experience, so that more people get to have a better time.
Yeah, I find that the reactionary approach can be detrimental. People have a tendency to go, "Oh my gosh, my curve is now vastly incorrect," as opposed to stepping back and go, "Wait, what may have caused that thing?" Because the problem with performance a lot of times is that people have a tendency to guess as to what they think the performance gap is, as opposed to actually measuring it. They see the curve bounce, I go, "Oh no, we have to do something immediately to fix this," as opposed to stepping back and go, "Maybe I should trace that." Or maybe I should rerun this thing to make sure, a few times, to make sure that I'm actually getting a decent baseline. That is a hard thing to teach, though, if you're not from a world where, and again, the notion of perfection is very hard to attain to begin with. Well, if you have someone who's got slow DNS, you kind of now know how that person feels, right? You should empathize a little bit more, I would hope, but it is tough to sort of smooth out the rough edges so that people don't make poor performance tweaks, because that can be just as detrimental as to doing nothing sometimes.
Yeah. So a couple of things on that. So I want to plug an article. I wrote it, but I wrote an article actually of 2017, which was about debugging React performance using DevTools. And so what that article does is it takes you through how to actually do an audit of a heavy JavaScript app and see the things that it's actually doing. Like, it's one thing to see these metrics and go, "Oh, that doesn't seem so good," but you don't know what to do next, right? So this article really focused on actually showing you what is happening inside the JavaScript main thread, seeing the functions that are running, diagnosing what the actual problem is so that you can go and fix it. So firstly, I want people to go to calibre.com/blog. You'll find it there. Study that because it's interesting, and the performance side of performance tooling in Chrome is definitely difficult. I think it's like every time I use it, I learn something still, and I build tooling for the browser. So yeah, definitely spend some time with that. But coming back to it, I think there is a bit of a gap in between knowing what a performance metric is and what it means, and then knowing what to do next. Right? That's the thing that people are having a lot of difficulty with. And so that's kind of where I'm spending a lot of my focus in writing and tutorials. And we're actually about to start writing a whole bunch of guides to help people with that more directly. So,
and I'll make sure we get those in the show notes too, to the blog and everything else, because I find articles like the ones that you've written quite a few articles over the years that I think have been very well received in terms of the way sort of critical request chains work and the way that sort of we approach the web. Because you're right, it is, again, the tooling has gotten better, but it's still quite difficult if you're not in there every day. I too, I'm of the same thing. I spend a lot of time in the Lighthouse tracker. I find it a lot of fun being a detective as to a lot of things that sort of flow through that tracker in terms of like, oh, why is your site behaving this way, or why does Lighthouse work? But I'm of the same way. I feel like I learn something new about the core of either Chrome or Chrome DevTools constantly every time I step foot into it. Do you find that, I feel like overall it's gotten easier it's a little bit more accessible to people who don't spend a lot of time there, but I feel like we still have some ways to go in terms of helping people get value out of those things that DevTools and other tooling that's built on top of things like CDP sort of are giving us today.
Yeah. So CDP, for anyone who doesn't know, is Chrome. It's the Chrome protocol, right? So it's how DevTools itself speaks to the internals of the browser and tells you everything that's going on in there. It's how Calibre works. It's how Lighthouse works. It connects directly to the browser and does all that stuff. It is, yeah, it's hard. It's hard, and that's why we're trying to make it better. As I said before, like we work pretty closely with the Lighthouse team, and they're really focused on how to make a dent in the web, as a whole, right? Mm-hmm. They're trying to offer a tool that gives people that, and they're doing I think they're doing a pretty great job. But there is a lot to go. There is a lot of hard work to do, and we have to bring people along on that journey as we learn as well, right? I mean, even if you look back a couple of years, people were using metrics like onload, right? And then there was this realization that onload wasn't really telling us anything, and only now we're starting to get these really deep and insightful metrics that describe something about a user experience. So it is happening, but at the same time, a lot of these, I don't know if you see these documents, but I do, that come out from the Lighthouse team, like internally, where they'll spend weeks studying ways of being able to, I've got an idea for a metric, and I think it'll describe this really effectively. And then you read 10 to 15 pages in a Google Doc of just reference and other information and benchmarks and all sorts of also it's super interesting, but if you're just trying to understand what to do next, it's a little much, right? So
I read those docs as well, and again, I'll put some links into the show notes too if people would like to see what one looks like. They're incredibly interesting documents, but yeah, to your point, yeah, they're very hard to go, oh, I'll just go do that right now. Because we're still not quite the way there yet. But I think this is actually a very valid point, Ben, is that a lot of thought goes into the sort of metrics that we're trying to track today, right? Beforehand, like you said, onload was a terrible metric. I still see people track that on dashboards and things, and it pains me. It pains me so because there's been a lot of research that the Chrome folks have done that people have contributed to over the years, and many of those docs that have really pushed us forward in terms of making the web faster, making things better for end users. But there's still I feel like people they're like, oh, it's just a new metric you all came up with yesterday. Yeah, that metric took like 4 months of like intense research to get to that. This was the number that does make sense. Like that's a legitimate number. So very hard to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I met you at the Chrome Dev Summit just in, what was it, November?
Yeah, I think
and
so.
Tim Dresser at Google, who's one of the folks that does that research, and I was like, oh great, I've read your documents. Let me tell you everything that I think about this. And we were back and forth, a solid 45 minutes about metrics that most people probably wouldn't be that concerned about. But I find it fascinating, and I think that that's why doing performance research and sharing it with people is such a empowering thing, because you're helping people cut through and see the value in something that is still early, right? It's still something that isn't fully resolved and everyone doesn't fully understand yet. So
there is some I feel like there's some misperception around that people think that performance is this very known thing today. Like we can basically what we know is that fast is better than slow. That's kind of what we know. And we're all trying to develop sort of tooling and metrics and the sort of things that'll make our lives easier as people writing that code at small and large scales. Like there's still a massive amount of things to do. Because a lot of people, I'm sure you get the same thing. People ask me all the time, hey, how do I make this thing faster? And my general default answer is, I have no idea. Because you just can't you just can't tell me the number that you had off of some score, regardless of the tool, and magically tell you how to make that thing better. I can fathom a guess, but we all know that that's just not how that sort of thing works today. You've been working with Calibre you've been working on Calibre a long time to sort of bring it to market and whatnot. What kind of feedback have you gotten from users in that regard as people who have started to use the product? Do they find that the metrics that you're starting to track over a wide span of time really start to show that improvement to them? Not just from I've tracked numbers thing, but actual I can make decisions from those numbers.
Yeah, I definitely. There's a lot of feedback, and there's a lot of people asking those questions, like which metrics should I use? And I think it'd be good to just touch on that for a minute if we can.
Sure, of course, yeah.
So coming back to what about, like, oh, somebody asks you, like, how can I tell what is slow or if it's slow? Firstly, so there are a couple of metrics that really are quite good at pointing at a possible problem or a possible thing going on there. So firstly, if we start with looking at paint metrics, so we're talking about first meaningful paint, first contentful paint. You can even say speed index in there as well. Those metrics look at when the browser either did the first thing the person could see, which is useful because it tells the person that something's happening or about to happen. Whereas with speed index, it's more about like when did the page become fully rendered and look like it was ready to go completely.
Mm-hmm.
Those are really good metrics because they just tell you kind of a user perception. It's not something that you can measure beyond that, but it's something that tells you, oh, hey, look, people are staring at a white screen for 9 seconds on a phone, and that isn't good enough. Like you yourself can know that if you watch a test like that and you see 9 seconds of white, you start fast forwarding because it's too long, right? So those metrics are great for that. And then probably my favorite metric to recommend, because it cuts through so much conjecture about, is this the right thing and does it tell us enough? And all of that is time to interactive, also known as TTI. TTI looks at the JavaScript main thread, and it looks for points at which the main thread was at rest. So that means all your JavaScript runs through the threaded environment, and it's broken up into these things called tasks. And so TTI looks at after the browser has hinted and there's been some stuff on the screen. If the user was to interact with click on a button, click on a drop down, try to log in, whatever it is, would the browser respond in a reasonable amount of time? Or is the CPU at 100% just trying to process JavaScript, right? And so that could be the downloading and parsing of your JavaScript, which is interesting from the perspective of, if you have 1 meg of JavaScript compressed, the browser has to download it, but then it has to uncompress it and then evaluate it and turn it into an AST and then something that can run on the main thread. And maybe it compression's pretty good for JavaScript, so 1 meg can become 3.5 megs pretty easily. And on a low end phone, that makes an impact, right? So on a thing that isn't a $3,000 computer that doesn't have a brand new CPU, maybe it's an Android that was cheaper or something like that, or sold in a different part of the world, or whatever it is, that makes an effect. And TTI is great because it tells you that. Like, it tells that on a desktop, the time to interactive was 7 seconds, and that's quite high. Actually, that's not very good. Like, we can get that down lower.
Mm-hmm.
And on a phone, the average is 19 seconds to TTI, which is quite a long time. So yeah, I really love that metric because it really describes, a wide, as long as you're testing at least 2 devices, like, all you need to do is test at least 2 devices. It's better if you test more, like a desktop that's fast, maybe a mid-range phone, and then quite a slow phone. But it'll tell you what your spread of metrics is, and that's really important to understand. What is your best case scenario and what is your worst case scenario?
Yeah, people have a tendency to cherry pick their metrics, right? When it comes to numbers out of the thing. Oh, I didn't run great on this one, but it ran great over here, and that's the one we're going to ship up.
Yeah, well, I guess the thing is, like, if you can make an older, slower phone feel fast or feel reasonable, it's going to fly on every single other device.
Totally, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, there definitely is that gap, though, where people aren't doing that testing, where you end up with that situation that, yeah, it's fast on that high-end device because you've got CPU to burn and RAM to use, but then you go to anything that's in the low end, and it doesn't even have to be the low end, even the mid-tier, you start to see memory profiles balloon up, and it's the TTI goes through the roof, which pains me because we have the tools. Like, we can decide our budgets and whatnot, which I know we haven't talked about yet, but we have some notion of the goals that we should be setting in terms of what that performance looks like.
Yeah, well, kind of, we do. I mean, I think we have aspirations.
Aspirations,
right?
That's a good word. Yes, let's go with aspirations.
Yeah, aspirationally, I want my website to appear in 1 second and be really fast. But the reality of building for the web and juggling everything is that it's not always that easy, right? But simply, let's get that, right?
Yeah.
I don't like budgets.
You don't like budgets?
No, I don't like budgets. So yeah, I know this is blowing your mind, right?
You're blowing my mind right now, Ben.
I know.
So for those out there who don't know, budget is basically some delineated number that you come up with. It could be for your bundle size or ATTI or some metric that you choose that you're trying to target. You have X amount of time or size to deal with. So a budget could be budgets are there's a lot of plugins these days for your tooling of choice, your Webpacks of the world and whatnot, that say, hey, you've overrun your budget against this target. Ben, tell me why you don't like budgets.
Okay, so let me back up the truck a little bit here. So budgets are an effective tool to be able to tell you that you've reached a certain threshold, and they're useful for that. They're useful for telling you your JavaScript size is over 500K, therefore you need to do something about it. The way that a budget, like if you think of like your account or your spending. A common way that people budget is that they have buckets, right? They say, well, I've got an entertainment budget of
Sure.
$200, and I've got a food budget of $400, or what? I'm sure it's not that much money. I was just making those up. But I'm like, wait, what are you eating every day? But that's the premise of a budget, right? But when it comes to a website, it's kind of different to say, oh, well, we shipped this much JavaScript, but it's okay because our images are small. And the point is
Ah,
that JavaScript isn't equal to images. It has a different effect on a device once it gets there. So budgets is useful to make people mindful, right? In the way I'm like, absolutely use budgets. It's a useful tool to make you focus, right? And it helps your team. That's good. And also to back up a bit further, Calibre has budgets, right? Like
yeah, I was gonna say, I'm
to a
pretty
tool.
sure that feature is in your software.
Yeah, for sure, right? But I guess my observations from watching hundreds of teams use it is that I don't think it's as effective as it could be. So budgets are useful for those things, but budgets aren't great for like paint metrics, right? Paint metrics can
Sure.
move around a little bit more. It's not like somebody changed, added a bundle and then you see added something to the bundle and the bundle gets bigger with a timing metric. Time to interactive, that's heavily affected by the JavaScript that's running there, which can be heavily affected by network, which can be affected by other. Like it just isn't that useful in my opinion, right? So what I'm really interested in and what we're starting and embarking on at Calibre is looking at over periods of time. So over the last week, has something changed by more than X percentage? Over the last 2 weeks, month, 3 months, 6 months, a year, has something changed by more than 10 to 15%? And that's kind of interesting to me. It's like, hey, maybe you can reward your hard work that you've done over 6 months, and you see a metric coming down in aggregate. That's really interesting to me because that means that you're offering something to a large amount of people at an improvement. And it's measurable, and that's really fascinating to me. So I think that we need to progress beyond budgets. We're building to help with that, so that you'll just get an email that everything about your current stats and where you've been and where you're going. So I think that the budgets are useful, but that to say is they're not the answer to everything.
There's definitely a limit to them, right? There's you like you said, you can't necessarily budget for things like paint. Just because you've reduced the size bundling of your JavaScript doesn't mean your JavaScript is fast, per se. Right? It has cost on the thread. You could do something silly that just destroys your performance, even though you've you've decreased the size and you're under your target budget. So you can't, and I think this is the problem with relatively static targets. So, and this is just my opinion, but the problem is that we have a tendency to get stuck on things that seem very sort of fathomable to us. So my lighthouse score is 90. I want it to be 95. Okay, I'm missing that 5. But is that 5 useful? It's hard to say.
Yeah.
Same thing with budgets, right? Oh, my target budget is 150. Okay, well I've hit 150, but have I realistically, like, should that mean I should stop doing improvements to that thing? Probably not. Right. So we have a tendency to get stuck in that. Oh, as long as I hit the number, everything is okay. But like you said, over time, as you track metrics and you start to see those decreases of X percent across a wide range of metrics, there is a lot more value there than it is just a singular static thing that one time you ran it. I totally agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, a budget is good for a reactionary thing, like where you added something to your JavaScript bundle. I wanted to plug really quickly. There was a great article out on the web.dev site by Milika that shows you how to use bundle size and shows you how to get it into your GitHub issues or to your I guess your CI service, right? Yeah, it's a really good article. It just shows you how to do it, cuts straight through. Definitely recommend that. I think, also, I think GitHub Actions is such a fascinating thing, and I'm so excited for it.
Isn't it though? It really is. It's I'm so glad they added it.
Yeah, I want to add all this stuff to my CI, to my continuous integration as well, and it's a pain. It's hard. have to run things. And then if you want it to appear on your pull request, that's a bit of a pain sometimes. And all of those things, right? So GitHub Issues for me is such an exciting thing because we can add these little bits of tooling in. So tracking a budget of a thing is definitely something that every team should do, right? I know I said I didn't like budgets, but I do think that, I do believe that. Tracking, the size of your script and being able to have a developer on a pull request say, hey, wait, maybe I need to do a little more here. That is so cool because that's so early in the piece. It's before a user has experienced it. It's part of your process. You all work on it together. You own it together. That's important. There's also great services like Percy that do diffing. So you can visually diff your website and see if something broke, on change that was maybe unrelated. And also they have plugins for stuff like you can hook up your React components with your React storyboard and have that post diffs of those components. So if you're working with like a component library or a style guide or whatever you want to call that, that's really enabling and powerful too. So I am so excited by GitHub Actions.
Yeah, I mean the CI story for web performance and a lot of these things we've been talking about has been a little bit bumpy, wouldn't you say? Like I think we all know it needs to be smoother, but we're all still sort of working to get there. I mean, I know that, for instance, for Calibre, you guys have a module now, like you can install it and sort of build scripts with it. Do you see the CI story starting to improve, not just for Calibre, but for a lot of the things that are out there now? Are we getting better at this?
I don't know about on the whole, but we're definitely working on it. So Calibre has a thing called Calibre CLI, which is a command line interface to Calibre. We're getting a lot of questions from customers like, how do I get the metrics out and put it into something else? Or how do I get a CSV? Or how do I create a test or update a site to have new settings or something like that? And it was difficult to keep up. And so we built this thing called CLI where you can have a one-line command to do kind of any of those things. If you want a CSV of the metrics of your site for the last 30 days, it's a one-line command and you can just get it out. So that's been incredibly enabling for our customers. But the other cool thing is that CLI is actually built in Node.js, and it's a package. It's open source. You can go to the repo, which is Calibre app/CLI, and you can import the Calibre module, and you can say, I do stuff like this for our enterprise customers who are onboarding. I had a week or two ago where they said, we want to test, I think it's 500 websites this company are testing, which is a lot. They're a multinational company with many brands and many languages involved. And they had this huge list of sites and this matrix of devices they wanted to test on. And so I used CLI to write a script that was, I think, about 50 lines long. It's using async await, and it's kind of nice. And it just went and created that in the account for them. It added all those URLs and set up all the testing environment for them so that it was just easy and automatic. And I think that's what tooling should offer, right? It should be repeatable. It should be understandable, and it should be where you are. So if you're in a terminal, be there. If you're in CI and you want people to be able to test in those environments, definitely do it there too. So on the CI side, we're working with some teams at the moment to be able to have that kind of coming through their pull requests, and they're deploying their sites to a pull request branch deploy, which you now, or you can do with Heroku, or you can do with probably a bunch of other services, right? Some people do it manually, which is hard because they have CDNs and stuff involved, but they're creating an environment that looks like production, that tests like production. It's not production, and they're getting metrics on that stuff. And I think that's where we need to head, right? Like performance needs to be everywhere that you are.
Totally agree. Yeah, I think that's a major gap that I know I struggle with this, trying to convince people that, artificial environments that don't behave like production have a tendency to give you that false sense of security. They are not true measures, and that's hard. because at that point you're really having to collect a lot of things out of prod. You can't necessarily gauge how fixes are going to necessarily work, and it's just it just takes a much longer time to get where you want to go for any particular app or site.
Yeah, I mean, we do this with QA at Calibre as well. I mean, we have all of our branches get deployed, as we do a pull request, and so if someone on the team, creates something that I don't want to pull it down to my own machine to see if it works or to see how it works or what it does, but I want to click around and see how it feels and see what that new interface feels like or whatever. So I just go to the pull request, I click the link at the bottom, and bang, I'm in there. I've got a copy of a database that looks kind of like an app. It's a seed data. It's not real data, but it's it just provides an environment where we can go and do that. And also we can run automated tests on that. So I think when you invest in your infrastructure to support the way that you'd ideally like to work, you get benefits that maybe you didn't first believe that would be there. So yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely a process. Like I think that a lot of people get a little scared off by the notion of, wait, I got to set up all these things just to be able to test, this. Like, why can't we just? Again, people get stuck in the ways that were, and yet at the same time they want the benefits of today in terms of the sort of tracking and metrics and the sort of performance tool that we have. That's just very hard to do. Like, I think you gradually have to move people as they sort of go down, because there is a lot of technical challenge in coming up with these. Like, there's not, I think ideally, like you said, we're moving in that direction. Like, we want to take out some of those pain points in the way that a lot of the performance tooling that we're all starting to rely on, it's just easier. We just want to make it simpler.
It is, yeah. I think the reason why, or the thing that keeps giving me belief that what I'm doing is important with Calibre is that even with free tooling like PageSpeed Insights or with Lighthouse or with other open source stuff, is that somebody has to do something. Somebody has to put some effort in where they could be doing something else. Like, they could be building an interface that fixes a thing for a user that sucks, or they could be configuring Lighthouse on a CI server. And it's like, well, it's not really a good use of your time, oftentimes, right? So that's one of the reasons why we build Calibre. But it's also because we know it's hard. It's definitely getting easier because of projects like Lighthouse, and how much Chrome. When we started, Chrome didn't have a headless mode at all, and the documentation for the protocol didn't. It existed, but it had a lot of holes in it, right? And so
it was a wee bit obtuse, one might say.
Yeah, and so I definitely learned a heck of a lot of stuff by reading source code, by hassling Mr. Paul Irish, who was very patient and very good with all of my questions. But not everyone can spend the time to do that. And offering a consistent environment. Like if you're ever thinking about building a tool and you're tossing up like if you should build it or not, let's just try to think about the work that you're going to save people. And the effort that you can, that they can put into something else. And so maybe that's like a good way to decide if something's worth doing.
I would agree. Yeah, I think, I was lamenting the fact a couple of weeks ago, I was on the road and I spent the last couple of months doing a lot of tracing for various folks. The type of tracing that you're not really writing code, you're just trying, you're playing detective for a lot of things across a lot of systems. And it's hard because at the end of the day, you're also trying to whittle down complicated things into actionable sort of tasks that not only you can sort of handle as the person doing that performance sort of regression testing and things. That's just a challenge. Like, and again, I'd like to. We're getting there, right? CDP's documentation has gotten significantly better over time. Obviously, we have things like Puppeteer now, which sort of take away or sort of extract away some of the low-level stuff that CDP does. That makes it a little bit easier if you want to write tooling around. Things like Lighthouse and Calibre, they both have node modules, so you can npm pull them and get started building your own sort of tools. You can integrate them into your test frameworks. Like, there are a lot of these things did not exist a couple of years ago. Like, I think people will go, "Oh, wow, this is great," and I'm like, I wish I would have had this 2 years ago. It would have been way simpler for a lot of things I was doing. So,
yeah, that's right.
yeah, I mean, this is a lot of the stuff is still relatively new. Like, I think that we have a tendency to forget that if you've sort of been in the weeds in the source code, like a lot of us have been for a few years.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of sort of takeaways of tracking metrics and those things, what do you find that pops up the most? What do you find that are common sort of performance pratfalls that affect folks that I suppose are reasonably fixable, that they simply maybe aren't tracking, or maybe they just miss? What's on your list of lists?
Yeah, sure. So I have two things to share here. One of them, firstly, so you already referenced the blog post that I did, so I'm going to plug it again because that's what I do apparently. I wrote an article for CSS Tricks called "The Critical Request," which looked at how browsers decide what to download and why they make that decision, and then it explains how to use that knowledge to make your font rendering faster. So one of the big problems that you and I have definitely seen hundreds of times, and any listener out there as well, is you go to a site on your phone, maybe you're sitting on the couch, and then suddenly the text appears, then it disappears, then it reappears again, and then layout jumps, and you're halfway. It's a really broken kind of experience of fonts loading and not loading and timing out and all that stuff. But the good news is we can control that now. So you can use preload in the browser, and you can tell the browser, hey, you don't know it yet, but you're going to need this web font. Go and download it. I'll display it when it's time. And the reason for that is a browser won't download a font until it sees a couple of things. And the first thing is it has to be in the style sheet. Say, hey, here's a font. It's called Helvetica, say, for example. Well, that's a bad example, but like a web font. And it'll say, okay, cool. There's a web font here. All right, registered, cool. And then it won't actually go and download that file until that font appears on the screen. Until there's some text that's targeted by CSS that says use this font. So single page apps are suspect to this. They're capable of not having any text rendered on the screen until the JavaScript initializes, right?
Mm-hmm.
But at that point in time, the browser's like, oh, there's a web font. Let me go and get that for you. I'll be 3 to 5 seconds. So the first thing you can do is you can tell the browser using preload, just go get it now. I know better. Just go get it now. You can also preload other important assets, which is really cool. And the other thing is that there's the font display CSS property, where you can tell the browser, hey, yeah, like there's a web font here, but I want you to display the fallback text first, right? Like, we don't need this web font to display some text to a user. We want it to just render immediately. So if you use a combination of preload and this optional property, then suddenly you have fonts rendering immediately, and that's like something you can do in usually a matter of minutes, and it's super powerful. So I think that's number one for me.
Yeah, I think I readily admit I put a link to that in various documentation all the time. So to that article, it was a very good article. I think and again, I think it's spot on, especially because people fail. Again, we've all experienced it, but I think a lot of people don't realize you can fix it now. You can make that change, and it's not a massive change in most cases. In most people's code bases.
So that's cool. Like, if there's something that you can do for almost free, go do that for sure.
What's second on your list? What else you got on that list, Ben?
Well, the second one is tracking your TTI, your time to interactive. We, like I was explaining earlier, we need to understand that different devices with different CPUs will load things differently, or be able to process JavaScript in a different way. And a function that takes 10 milliseconds on your computer may take 250 on a phone. So firstly, you got to track it to know. So that's important.
Mhm.
But secondly, the TLDR there is deliver less script, and that's it, right? Which sounds easy, but it's not. We all know that that's not, because we bundle our JavaScript into a big bundle, and it includes everything that we need to make this website work. But if you're using some newer tooling, you can, so in Webpack, there's this thing called code splitting. And there are other systems that do this as well. React has a really cool new thing, kind of new, I guess, called suspense. Right? Have you seen this thing?
I have.
Okay, so what it does is it allows you to say, you can tell React, here's a component, I want you to lazily load it. So you say, import, use the brand new import keyword, and that returns a promise. And so essentially, it tells React, like, this is a reference to a module that will be available at some time. And then you can use this little suspense block to say, show a loader until that's available. And if you're using Webpack, what it'll do is it'll code split on that component. So if you've got a component that links to a bunch of other smaller components that are used elsewhere in the code base, they'll actually be separated into different files, because Webpack is smart enough to know that. So instead of delivering, that huge bundle, we can deliver a smaller bundle up front and then progressively load parts of the app or the site that we need as we need them, right? And that can make a huge impact on TTI. I've seen sites halve their TTI as soon as they're able to do this. And so if you are using some new tooling there, it's not for free, but it's not that much more effort, actually. And so I think that's really exciting and interesting too.
Yeah, I think the lazy load sort of scenario and the code splitting of those sort of imports, you definitely see them in a lot of tools now. I think Polymer pushed that pretty hard with Purple and everything else, and the way that it genned out things as sort of in a web component world sort of thing. You see that in a lot of other tools too. I think Vue has something very similar now where it'll split things. So that makes me happy. Like, I think it took us a long time to get to that point where, oh yeah, we should split these things up, and oh, I should not load all these things like immediately. Because I think one of the discrepancies I see a lot with, and you possibly see this as well, is that people don't quite grasp main thread performance. Like, they don't really understand what that pack of JavaScript does when it loads up, and because they just don't know, right? It's slow, and oh, my TTI is 15 seconds down the wire, or not down the wire, but rather down the lane, and that's tough, right? And if the tools get better around that, ideally we split more things out, and life gets a little bit better for our TTI.
Yeah. 5 years ago, we didn't have a way of visualizing this stuff.
True. Yeah. Non-existent.
Non-existent. I mean, if you wanted to use Chrome DevTools protocol, you could watch all the events coming out of the browser, and you could surmise this if you were a complete genius and knew to do that. But we've only had these visualizations for a relatively short time, and it takes a while for people to learn how to use them and learn how to interact with it, and also for the tools to catch up. And I think the exciting thing is the tools are catching up finally, and we have those visualizations, we have monitoring, we have all that stuff. It's really on us to spend some time figuring out what is important. And I know that isn't the easiest thing, but we need to figure out that important stuff where we can make an impact, and we can do it. And that's where tools, right? Where tools just get out of the way, give you something you couldn't do before.
For sure. And I think that's I think if we continue down that road, that the web developers as a whole will be better off. I think that's, like you said, if we continue taking away some of the complexity that we can and make the developer experience better, users will win there too. But in the meantime, if we don't have those tools, oh, please look at your bundle size before you send less script. Please send less script.
Yeah, do it for sure. Absolutely.
Well, Ben, we're up about against time at this point. I could sit here all day and talk performance things because I love talking performance with you. And for for people out there who want to get a hold of you or find you on the internets, where would the best place to be to find you?
Yeah, so you can go to calibreapp.com and find out, sort of what I've been talking about, what I'm trying to build with the team here. And you can follow me on Twitter as well. I'm Ben Schwarz on Twitter. Most of my writing these days is going into Calibre. And like I said, we're kind of we're starting right now to work on a big old performance guide. So if you are interested in trying to figure out ways of talking to your team about performance or introducing it, or how do you evaluate thing to do next, that kind of thing, I definitely recommend that you keep watching what we're up to. And you can do that by we've got a couple of mailing lists as well. So we have one called perf email. So it's perf.email, is the URL. And if you go there, we send a newsletter that's just centered around the idea of best quality content from around the web and stuff that we're working on and thinking about too, in all things performance and user experience. So yeah, do that.
And we'll make sure to get all those links in the show notes so users out there can come and make sure they can find all this stuff. Well, Ben, when the guide comes out and you start writing more stuff, come back on the show. Tell us more about it. Because we would love to have you back.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to.
Fantastic. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this has been episode number 182 of the Web Platform Podcast. Today we've been talking with Ben about Calibre and web performance and all the things, little tips and tricks that you can use to sort of make your web app better for your end users and make your developer experience just a little bit smoother. Tune in next week when we talk more things web, more things platform. And ideally, the rest of the cast and show crew will be out of the polar vortex. Hey, have a great rest of your week.